Well, welcome everybody. I'm Ross Sandler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for New York City Law, and I welcome you to this very special occasion. There are still some seats available, and there's coffee on both sides of the room, and regretfully we have an overflow room, although we're happy that so many people came. But this is the first time we've ever had to do this, and I do apologize for those who might had expected to be in this room and are in the overflow room. But we welcome you, and we're delighted that you're here. First, let me introduce Dean and President of New York Law School, Anthony Crowell.
Thanks so much, Ross. Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Great. I want to welcome you all to New York Law School, or as we like to say, New York's Law School. I'm Anthony Crowell, Dean and President here, and it's a real honor for us today to welcome U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, Preet Bharara, for our City Law Breakfast on the 20th anniversary of the Center for New York City Law and this breakfast series, and as the law school approaches its 125th anniversary. The U.S. Attorney leads an office that has a storied and distinguished history, filled with the best legal minds and most forceful legal advocates. And U.S. Attorney Bharara has gone above and beyond in leading this office and building its legacy. This is the most widely attended city law breakfast ever. And I think it's because it's true. I think it's because what happens in New York matters everywhere. I know you are all eager to hear what the U.S. Attorney has to say, especially today. And I'm sure you'll have many questions. So now let me ask City Law's founder and director, Ross Sandler, to come back and formally introduce the U.S. Attorney. Ross?
Thank you, Dean Crowell. This is a special occasion. We are really delighted that Preet Bharara agreed to speak. And we thank him for honoring his commitment. This is a busy day. It's been a busy week. And I do appreciate the fact that you honored the commitment and that it speaks well of you and the office that we all served in. Preet Bharara was born in Punjab, India, grew up in Monmouth County, New Jersey, was valedictorian of his high school, the Ranney School, magna cum laude at Harvard, Columbia Law graduate, law review, private practice, then an assistant U.S. attorney handling organized crime cases, then to Washington to work with Senator Schumer and committees, and then back in 2009 to head up the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District. In his position, he has maintained the excellence of the office in the areas that are most important: terrorism, financial fraud, white-collar crime, organized crime, and he has been at the forefront of public corruption. Yesterday's complaint, as newsworthy and as important and maybe milestone that it was, it's not the first. There have been 3 state senators, 3 assembly members, 2 council members. All have been indicted, convicted in the Southern District under his leadership. The Southern District is a special place, and what is important for those of us who've followed it and have had the honor of being an assistant is the integrity and the independence of the office. And to just call out 2 of the people in the room today, there's many people that I could mention, but 2 of who were senior to me when I was an assistant. Mike Armstrong here went on to be the counsel and executive director of the Knapp Commission, 1972, a commission that reviewed police corruption and which is still relevant today. And then Frank Turkheimer over here went on to be a Watergate prosecutor and himself a U.S. attorney in Wisconsin. And there are many others here, but that's the tradition of the office. And what is important, besides the day-to-day and the important work that goes on, is that integrity and the independence of the office, which Preet Bharara has maintained, has made even greater, and is leaving a legacy of great responsibility for those that will follow in that great line of assistant U.S. attorneys. I bring to the podium Preet Bharara.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here with so many people, such a large crowd. I understand there's an overflow room. I see some public officials here. And after yesterday, I guess I have two theories as to why that might be. One is that you knew that I would be taking attendance. And the other is there are a lot of folks now looking for immunity. I want to thank New York Law School for organizing the event. In particular, I'd like to thank Arthur Abbey, Chair of the Board of Trustees, Anthony Crowell, President and Dean of the New York Law School, and Ross Sandler, Professor and Director of the Center for New York City Law, and an alum of the office. I want to acknowledge folks from my own office who I directed to come here. I don't know if they came. Is there anyone from my office? I guess I'm all alone. I had not planned to speak about public corruption when I agreed to do this event some months ago, but given the timing of things, I was going to talk about Bruce Springsteen most of the time, but given the timing of things, I thought there is maybe a little bit of interest in public corruption, and I would talk broadly and maybe vaguely about that for a little while. So let me start by talking a little bit about our overall approach to corruption. Some of you may have heard me talk about these things before. I think there are new faces, though. And so I think it's important for people to understand how I and my office think about the mission against public corruption. So first, let me make clear what the mission is not about. We are not trying to criminalize ordinary politics. We're not trying to wag our fingers or thump our chests, nor, quite frankly, are we even demanding that our government officials be virtuous or vice-free. We are prosecutors, not morality cops. So if you feel the urge to send inappropriate tweets, knock yourself out. We don't care about that. Just try not to steal our money. We simply want people in high office to stop violating the law. It seems like a simple and modest request. People elected to make laws should not be breaking them. But prosecuting public corruption, for the most part, is like prosecuting every other type of crime. As with every other area, we are fundamentally fearless, the people in my office, and we have a long tradition of fearlessness, and appropriately aggressive. We go wherever the facts and the law take us. We just do our jobs. I like to quote from one of my favorite movies, The Departed, and there's a scene there where Mark Wahlberg is asked the question when someone comes in and is complaining about something, and Mark Wahlberg says, what's going on? And the guy says, who the F are you? And Mark Wahlberg says, I'm the guy who does his job. You must be the other guy. And that's essentially how the career prosecutors in my office think of themselves. And so when people have concerns or questions or intimations about what motivates them and why they do what they do and how they pick their targets and how they do their research and how they prosecute their cases, the ethic of the place is they're just doing their job. So first, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the problem of public corruption, maybe why it exists. A lot of people have talked about this for a long time, but here's my 2 cents. In the series of cases that we have brought, some of which were mentioned in the introduction, including the one we brought yesterday, they, I think, go to the very core of what ails Albany. And I said this yesterday. It's a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability, and lack of principle, joined with an overabundance of greed, cronyism, and self-dealing. I mean, it seems sometimes that Albany really is a cauldron of corruption. As I also said yesterday, politicians are supposed to be on the people's payroll, not on secret retainer to wealthy special interests they do favors for. Now, one of the most commonly asked questions about public corruption is why? Why do we have this problem, however extensive one thinks it is? Why do officials who are supposed to hold the public trust and who are supposed to know better keep breaking the law, even knowing what the consequences will be? And why is it so bad, in particular, in New York? Now, as I always say, I am not a behavioral psychologist or a political pundit. or a social scientist, so I don't really know the answer. The answer may not be knowable, and probably there is no single answer, even if it were knowable. I suppose it is some combination of hubris and greed and ambition on the part of corrupt and corruptible officials. I suppose also that there are temptations in the system, weaknesses in oversight, and gaping holes in transparency. But I want to make a couple of observations about some of those causes. Often, corruption is about greed. Simple as that. Greed on the part of elected or appointed officials whose responsibility is to the public and whose salaries are paid by the taxpayer, whether it's by selling votes for cash or embezzling funds in their trust or otherwise. There are a spate of instances where elected officials have sought to monetize their public position. Money often seems to be at the core of the problem. I was asked yesterday by someone how the case we brought yesterday was different from other cases, and in some ways it is because of the standing and stature of the person who was charged, but in many ways it's business as usual in our public corruption unit. Case after case after case we have brought has had at its base money, and specifically a person who was in the public trust, or supposed to hold the public trust, and sought ways to monetize his or her position. Consider, some cases from the last few years where convictions have already been obtained. We had a case against City Councilman Dan Halloran, which you may remember, and he was caught on tape in a case, and he's now convicted and awaiting sentencing. After allegedly receiving a $7,500 cash bribe, he says to the cooperating witness on tape, quote, "Money is what greases the wheels, good, bad, or indifferent." During that same meeting, Halloran says, quote, "That's politics. That's politics. It's all about how much, and that's our politicians in New York. They're all like that, all like that. And they get like that because of the drive that the money does for everything else. You can't do anything without the effing money." Close quote. He didn't say effing, he said the other word. You may recall another case that we brought against New York State Assemblyman Eric Stevenson, who is convicted also and currently serving a 3-year prison sentence. Eric Stevenson, as we proved, accepted over $22,000 in bribes from 4 businessmen in exchange for helping them open and operate adult daycare centers in the Bronx. Not only that, the businessmen gratefully named their center after Assemblyman Stevenson's grandfather, which was very sweet. Stevenson allegedly not only helped the businessman obtain necessary permits and recruit clientele, but also, in exchange for cash bribes, introduced actual legislation barring the opening of competing adult daycare centers in the city. In other words, Stevenson tried to enact a statutory moratorium to give his co-defendants a local monopoly. That was about money, too. That was about monetizing the position, too. And as I said at the time, among other things, it is a fairly neat trick to hatch a scheme that offends core principles of both democracy and capitalism simultaneously. Here's Eric Stevenson in his own words, as recorded in the case. Quote, "Bottom line, if half the people up here in Albany was ever caught for what they do, they would probably be in jail. So who are they BSing?" That's Stevenson talking about his former colleagues, showing that he was maybe right about at least one thing. So how should all of this make us feel as citizens and as taxpayers? And again, as I've said before, I think the people of New York should be disappointed, but they should be more than disappointed. They should maybe be angry. When so many of their leaders can be bought for a few $1,000s, they should think about getting angry. When it is more likely for a New York State senator to be arrested by the authorities than to be defeated at the polls, maybe they should think about getting angry. And they should ask some pointed questions. Given the allegations in case after case after case, how many other pending bills were born of bribery? And worse, how many past bills were born of bribery or improper influence? How about items in the budget? How much of the work of the city and the state government is tarnished by tawdry graft? While I continue to believe that public corruption in New York is more than a prosecutor's problem, you should rest assured that the people in my office are extremely busy and will continue to do what prosecutors do. And that means being as aggressive and proactive on public corruption as we are on gangs and drugs and organized crime and insider trading and everything else. Because whenever corruption is on the rise, that means democracy is on the decline. And that means that law enforcement will use every aggressive tool at our disposal, wiretaps and confidential informants and undercover agents and stings. We don't care, and I think people get this by now, we don't care if you are a city official or a state official, if you are a Democrat or a Republican, if you are a backbencher or a gavel-wielding leader in your body. If you have broken the law, we will do everything we can to hold you accountable. Now let me make another observation about what part of the problem may be, at least in New York and Albany specifically. And here, allow me the indulgence of speaking as a citizen a little more than as a prosecutor, which I think from time to time I'm entitled to do. It's the concentration of power. Power in New York State, as far as anyone can tell, is unduly concentrated in the hands of just a few men. Some say just 3 men. There are, by my count, 213 men and women in the state legislature, and yet it is common knowledge that only 3 men essentially wield all the power: the governor, the assembly speaker, and the Senate president. So I must confess a little bit of confusion about this. When did this come to pass? Why has everyone just come to accept it? So I have a little bit of a hard time getting my head around this concept of 3 men in a room. Maybe it's just me. I'm an immigrant from India, which is overpopulated. So for me, it's like 1 billion men in a room. So it could be that I'm just a little bit dense about it, but I would think that it wouldn't just be me, that lots of people would have questions about 3 men in a room. Like, why 3 men? Can there be a woman? Do they always have to be white? How small is the room that they can only fit 3 men? Is it 3 men in a closet? Are there cigars? Can they have Cuban cigars now? After a while, doesn't it get a little gamey in that room? The concept of 3 men in a room seems to have disappointingly taken root as opposed to being questioned. It's almost become like part of the furniture, the political furniture. And it's weird to me a little bit that officials and writers joke about it good-naturedly, as if they're talking nostalgically about an old sitcom coming up after Happy Days. It's 3 men in a room. Or like it's a hijinks comic movie involving a baby with Ted Danson and Tom Selleck and Steve Guttenberg changing diapers. Or maybe, I don't know, the 3 Amigos. So 3 men in a room, is that really how government should be run? Is that really the way to run a state of almost 20 million people? When did 20 million New Yorkers agree to be ruled by like a triumvirate in Roman times? You know, important decisions in my own office are made with more than just 3 people in a room. In fact, the decision to federally charge the Speaker of the Assembly yesterday was made by more than 3 people in a room. And, you know, on a serious note, the concept and the dynamic of 3 men in a room has consequences. Common sense will tell you that. If you know you won't have power unless you are one of the lucky 3, why would you bother to run and join the legislature in the first place? Good people don't waste their time that way. If you want to make a difference or you want to make a change, you might not bother if you know you can't be one of the 3. It seems to me that if you're one of the 3 men in a room and you have all the power, and you always have, and everyone knows it, you don't tolerate dissent because you don't have to. You don't allow debate because you don't have to. You don't favor change or foster reform because you don't have to, and because the status quo always benefits you. And on the other side of the coin, if you're one of the 3 men in the room, you keep people in the dark because you can. You punish independent thinking because you can. You demand lockstep loyalty because you can. You get swept up in the power and the trappings because you were never challenged and because you can easily forget who put you there in the first place. And so I ask again, what kind of a system is that everyone seems to accept and good-naturedly joke about. Is that really the best way? And I venture to guess that not a single person in this room or the overflow room or perhaps anyone else, save for three, disagrees with me. Now, I'm not making any policy pronouncement at all. I'm just saying. So there are lots of causes. We have the issue of money. We have the issue of the dynamic, the concentration of power. But at the end of the day, and I think this is true not just in politics but in other institutions also, at the end of the day, I think there's a problem of culture. It seems that a culture of corruption has developed and grown, as I said some time ago, just like barnacles on a boat bottom. And it seems that such a culture has become so embedded that even a series of tough and successful prosecutions that have separated so many lawmakers from their liberty has not been enough to thwart others from following in their felonious footsteps. And just as with barnacles on a boat bottom, when a growth is permitted to spread and grow unchecked, it unsurprisingly takes an unrelenting, collective effort to clean it up. Here's a culture problem that I talk about a lot when I speak, as I often do, to business groups and to students at business school, when I'm talking to hedge fund industry folks and heads of banks and people who are involved in compliance and law enforcement. And it's a worry that I have that in a lot of places, in a lot of quarters, people learn to be focused on just what the line is, the technical line, and they think about how close they can get to the line without going over. And it's what I call aspiring to the minimum. And when I speak at business schools and to business groups, I decry it, as you might imagine, because it is not a good way to foster a good culture. It's not a good way to prevent bad things from happening. It's not a good way to prevent subpoena-wielding prosecutors like those in my office from coming knocking on your door. And as I say to the business people that I speak to, I think people in America, and I understand the bottom line and the profit motive, but I think people should expect from financial institutions that can affect economies and that employ tens or hundreds of thousands of people, that they should aspire to something more than the minimum. And the more we do in public corruption, I think the same principles apply there as well. If everyone around you is thinking, how close to the line can I get? What is the ethical violation precisely? How can I make sure I'm just to the left of what the outside pay rules are? Or how can I make sure I'm just to the left of what the disclosure obligations are, or just to the left of what the campaign finance rules are? I mean, that's great. Knock yourself out. But it's going to get you in trouble. And it sends a message to everyone else that it's okay to do. And not everyone is going to stay on the right side of that line, particularly when that message is coming from the top. I sometimes analogize it to someone who is trying to be very clever in how to avoid a drunk driving conviction. And I suppose if you're really smart, there are a few people who are this smart, but I suppose if you're really smart and you go to the bar and you're having drinks and you know your body weight and you know how many drinks you're having and you know the pace at which you're having the drinks, you know how much food you've had, you can figure out with some precision, I suppose, how to stay just on the correct line of the DUI limit. And I suppose you can do that a couple of times. But imagine how quickly it will be before a person like that gets pulled over on the highway. Imagine how quickly a person like that is going to blow the legal drinking limit. And imagine how quickly someone like that is going to kill someone on the highway. And yet that seems to be the same principle of conduct and attitude and approach of not just malefactors on Wall Street, but those in city and state government as well. Not everyone, but too many people. And when you have enough people who are promoting that culture, that's a problem. I mean, we had an example some years ago of the former Senate president instructing people, I think people remember this, to hand deliver their disclosure forms so as to avoid a mail fraud count. I would say, I didn't even make that up. So why should we care about this? I mean, a lot of people can't name their state legislator. They can't name at least two of the three men in the room. And they think politicians don't really matter to their daily lives. The problem is the opposite is true. State legislators, believe it or not, are important. Each senator represents more than 300,000 people. Each assemblyman, almost 130,000. Senators confirm appointments of state officials and court judges. State lawmakers determine our budget. They decide how much money goes to children's education, to public safety, to transportation, to health, and to public welfare. They decide what constitutes a crime and how it should be punished. They decide about how much we pay for rent, in housing, and in taxes. And as we revealed yesterday, there are issues that go to the core of the case yesterday that are about laws that are up for renewal right now in the body that we're talking about. And separate and apart from all the things that legislators are supposed to do that are important to ordinary citizens, think of the things that they could do. I mean, for a long time it's been said that the real work of innovation and entrepreneurship and change takes place not at the federal level but in state houses. And lots of governors like to boast about that. And state governments are supposed to be engines for innovation. They're supposed to be incubators for new ideas. And when people are consumed by these other things and they don't care and the voters don't care to make them care, then that goes down the drain also. Another reason why we should care, at least we should care, is that when you have these kinds of examples of conduct and misconduct over time, it, I think, undermines our faith in our own system and in democracy. You know, when a New York State senator is more likely to be arrested by the authorities than defeated in an election, as I said, people lose faith. When voters' campaign contributions can routinely foot the bill for a fancy lawyer when that legislator is later charged with corruption, people lose faith. When state senators are advised, as I said, by the Majority Leader's Council in writing to hand-deliver their financial disclosures to avoid federal mail fraud charges, people lose faith. And when politician after politician after politician elected by the voters falls to criminal charges, people lose faith. At the end of the day, if yesterday's charges are proven true, and there's a presumption of innocence, of course, that at least one of the proverbial three men in a room is deeply compromised, then how can we possibly trust that anything that gets decided in Albany and imposed upon the rest of us is on the level? How can we trust that anything is on the level? So at the end of the day, the jobs of prosecutors are to hold people accountable, to make sure that they are following the law and we're enforcing the law without fear or favor. But the hope is, at least my hope is, that a byproduct of bringing powerful and strong and righteous and appropriate cases is that there will be reform. And that almost happened with the Moreland Commission, but it turned out to be a little bit fleeting. You know, people sometimes say, does it matter if you change the law? And I'm not, again, an expert on these things, but I'll give you one example that occurred to me when I was asked a question after we announced the charges yesterday. And again, I'm not talking about anything outside of the four corners of the complaint and nothing beyond what I said yesterday. But someone asked the question yesterday, you know, does it matter? And I said, you know, part of the allegations in the case are that the Speaker of the Assembly was secretly giving $250,000 grants on two different occasions to a doctor who was causing patients to be referred to his law firm, thus causing a stream of payments to be put into the Assembly Speaker's pocket. And he was doing this, we allege, in the complaint, in a way that had no transparency and no one knew. He had a pot of money under HICRA of $8.5 million with which he could do whatever he wanted. If he wanted to return a favor, if he wanted to dispense it appropriately or for a good cause, or, as we allege, as a quid pro quo for a stream of payments coming back to him. And part of the evidence in the case, as outlined in the complaint very clearly, is that in 2007, when there was an unusual bout of reform and the Budget Reform Act was passed, the ability to dole out money from that $8.5 million fund secretly and without transparency was ended. And you know what else ended at that time? The stream of payments, as we allege corruptly, to the Doctors Research Center. Now, there was nothing preventing, as we say in the complaint, the Speaker of the Assembly, if it was a good cause, who was one of the three men in the room and who has access to all the purse strings you could possibly imagine, and who said at the time that this was a good cause because it was for mesothelioma research, which affected a lot of people who were made ill after 9/11. But that didn't happen. Why? Because, as we allege, there was something corrupt about those grants. So that's a small example of a case in which a certain kind of fraud stopped happening because a light was shown on a problem. So reforms can work. They have to be sensible, and they have to be prudent. I've said, I'll conclude with a point that seems obvious and that I've made before, and that is prosecutors can't do all the work, although we're really, really busy, and hopefully we make an impact. It's up to voters, and it's up to people to get angry, as I said. People need to demand more. It's not just enough to be fed up. When in New York, politician after politician after politician breaks bad, that's a time to say, no more half measures. And I think given the interest and the attention to some of the cases we brought and continue to bring, this can finally be perhaps a turning point for reform. After all, as Edward R. Murrow observed, a nation of sheep will beget a government of wolves. If ever there was a moment for real reform, I think it's now, and the public has to demand more, individual voters acting and speaking collectively. New York tends to have the best of everything, and it deserves better in this area also. New York is home to the safest large city in America. It should not harbor one of the most corrupt governments in the nation. New York is full of the best problem solvers everywhere, and no state has people who are more thoughtful, more industrious, more resilient, more demanding, and more impatient than New York. And if there was ever a time for New Yorkers to show their trademark impatience with the status quo and to show it loudly, I submit now's a good time for that. Thanks for hearing me.
Terrific remarks. Thank you. I want to make a few remarks and we'll open questions. Stay right here. Stay right here. Well, by that ovation, you sensed how appreciative the audience is. I want to just make a few announcements. First, that these breakfasts are sponsored by our loyal founding sponsors, Consolidated Edison. We thank you for being here. Francis Reshevsky, Senior Vice President, Greenberg Traurig, the law firm of Greenberg Traurig, and Verizon are our founding sponsors. And then we have special sponsors for this breakfast, Guidepost Solutions. We thank Bart Schwartz for that. And Castellanos and Fink, Claude Millman. Those are our special sponsors for this. And then we always like to thank our Gold Star sponsors. Now, if you volunteered to pay a slight fee for the breakfast, you get a Gold Star on your name tag. And that's what those Gold Stars are. And we are especially appreciative of the Gold Star attendees. This is the 118th City Law Breakfast. We've been doing this for 20 years. And our 119th breakfast will be in February, and we'll have Mira Josie will be here, chair of the City Taxi and Limousine Commission. There are issues there of importance. Now I'll open it up for questions. We have microphones. We ask you to be short in your comment or question. I ask first the special sponsors, Bart Schwartz, if you'd like to make a comment first, and Claude Millman, if I don't quite see Claude. Again, I expect there'll be many comments or questions. I ask that they be relatively short.
Well, I have lots of questions.
I ask also that they be relatively easy.
Right. Well, I read the complaint yesterday, but I won't ask those questions. One comment and then a question. Your point about people doing just enough to stay below the line or not go over the line of misconduct is a very good one, and it's frankly, I think it's a failure of people to recognize the difference between compliance and ethics. And if people focused more, and companies and others more, on ethics and what's right or wrong, you would have fewer problems and fewer people who would think about just where is the line that I don't want to cross.
I agree.
Yeah. My question is this. There's been a lot of discussion recently about indicting individuals in the complex financial cases. And I know General Holder spoke about it at NYU a few weeks ago. And I'd just like to get your thoughts. In ancient times, when Ross and I were assistant U.S. attorneys, the cases were not as complex. And when corporations were indicted, we almost always included individuals, or certainly tried to. And I know that doesn't happen as often. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a gold star question. First, if I could, just your first point and just echo what you were saying about the difference between following the rules and ethics. I will concede, as I do when I talk to business groups, that regulations are not perfect and rules are not perfect. I'm the United States Attorney. I'm subject to rules and to regulations, and a lot of them, quite frankly, are stupid. And don't tell the regulators I said that. Don't tell Washington. And that can be so. So if compliance officials in industry are only teaching people how to follow the rules as promulgated, you're not teaching them much of anything. You're not teaching them to think for themselves how they should conduct themselves and behave properly, A, because the rules might not be perfect, and they're usually geared towards the lowest common denominator, but also because it's a violation of how we should be teaching about the principle, but how we should be teaching about doing the right thing. And the analogy I tend to use is it's like if you only had teachers who were teaching to the test. The purpose of school is to educate people and make them wise and teach them how to learn for themselves. Now, you should also do well in the test, and you should pay attention to the test, and you should do your reading and do your homework and pay attention to what the teacher thinks is important so you can predict what's going to be on the test. But if all our schools did was teach people how to take tests, we would have a bunch of crappy people, and America would go down the drain. I think it's not that different when you're talking about, further to your point, when you're talking about corporations and companies. If all you're doing is analyzing what regulation the SEC put out, or the FTC put out, or whatever alphabet combination you want, then you're not teaching them to behave properly. And so I couldn't agree with you more. With respect to individuals versus corporations, look, the bread and butter of the U.S. Attorney's Office is and always has been and always will be, on the criminal side, the prosecution of individuals when you can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But we have other tools in our toolbox also. And so sometimes it's the case you prosecute individuals. Sometimes it's the case that you prosecute individuals and the entity, as we did with SAC Capital and as we've done with any number of corporations, because the law permits us in our discretion, and if certain guidelines are met and thresholds are met, to charge the entire institution because it's pervasive and there's a history of misconduct and there's been recidivism and you're trying to make both a specific and general deterrence point. Sometimes it's the case that you can't charge individuals even if you would like to because the statute of limitations is run, and sometimes that's so because there has been obstruction. Sometimes you can't charge individuals because some of the evidence cannot be obtained and it sits overseas. And a prime example of that, which I think was a very important case, we brought a case and resolved a case against Toyota Motor Corporation because they were, bluntly and frankly, talking a lot of BS about their safety issues with floor mats, which caused, a lot of problems for a lot of people. And the regulators could only get a maximum, I think, of $57 or $58 million, notwithstanding all the misconduct that had taken place. We in our office spent 4 years looking closely at everything that we possibly could, and for various reasons that we talked about at the time we announced the case, and their agreement to engage in a deferred prosecution agreement, which is the filing of criminal charges held in abeyance, the payment of $1.2 billion, reforms, an outside monitor, and everything else. And I think that was a good result. A lot of the recalls that you're seeing that are taking place and a lot of the care that auto manufacturers are taking in whether or not they take bad cars off the road or whether or not they tell NHTSA and the Department of Transportation about some internal problem instead of sweeping it under the rug, they are more likely now, because of that case, that was with respect to a corporation, unfortunately not also individuals, but they're doing that because of that case. So where it's appropriate, we do individuals. Where it's appropriate, we do both. And where it's appropriate or impossible, we sometimes just have an action against the institution.
My name is George Bulow. I'm an entrepreneur. I live in Manhattan, therefore I'm in the Southern District. So my question is a state question, of course, and it's about the
Even if you were elsewhere, you would still probably be in the Southern District.
West, just not Brooklyn or Long Island. With regard to the Moreland Commission, there was a statement yesterday by a high political official that in dismissing the Moreland Commission in this particular instance, part of the reasoning he stated was that the subpoena powers of federal prosecutors or other prosecutors was greater and therefore could do what he felt should be done. And I'm wondering if you might comment on that question, technical question admittedly, as to what the powers of a Moreland Commission or a NAP Commission or any other commission that is ever put together in the state, in this state, are as compared to those available to prosecutors, particularly federal prosecutors?
Yeah, I don't know who you're talking about. You know, I'm very confused about the Moreland Commission, as I think a lot of people are, and various people have I think over time, put this delicately, have given maybe 18 or 19 different explanations, depending on the time, as to what its powers were, what its level of independence was or should be as a practical matter or as a legal matter. So I'm done sort of analyzing that. What we do is, going back to the departed, is we just do our jobs. We're the guys who do our jobs. I tend to think, not just for parochial reasons and local pride reasons, that the best ability to do public corruption prosecutions in particular, and I think a lot of cases in general, is a U.S. Attorney's Office, and particularly the Southern District of New York. We have a well-deserved reputation for independence. The nickname of our office, some people think it's pejorative. I tend to think not, is the Sovereign District of New York, not the Southern District of New York. We have a tradition, and the alumni of the office believe in that same tradition. I know Commissioner Rose Gilhern, former Commissioner Rose Gilhern of the Department of Investigation, who was one of the principal partners with whom we did a lot of these cases, and without whom we would not have been able to do these cases over time. She understands it. We understand it in our office, that you really can't have faith and confidence and trust that people are doing corruption cases, in particular, in the right way, because they're so sensitive, unless you believe in their absolute independence. Every time, by the way, we prosecute somebody, there is a constituency of people who suggest ill motive. Some people say, well, you know, you're going after African Americans. Another time, people said you're going after Chinese Americans. Another time, to come up with something very convoluted, we prosecuted an Indian American. Well, obviously, Preet hates Indian Americans. I'm like, really? Okay. Sometimes they say, you know, you must be going after Democrats. You must be going after Republicans because, you know, you once worked for a Democrat. Then when you go after a Democrat, the question is, well, why didn't you do it a month before the election? And it seems to me, over time, if you over and over and over again take the tough and right position, no matter who the person is, people understand that you're independent. You know, we don't have to be elected. We don't have to curry favor with anybody. And I think there are very, very good prosecutors who are elected, but the structure of the situation for us tends to be, I think, you know, favorable to bringing tough and hard prosecutions. I mean, the woman who hired me as, you know, one of the most independent people in this position ever, Mary Jo White, knew what her job was. And when there was this issue of the Mark Rich pardon, she commenced an investigation which may have implicated the president who appointed her. And that's what we do. And it's a little bit surprising sometimes when people, it's great to get the applause that people give my office sometimes about doing hard cases, but that's just what we do. That's what we've always done, and that's what we always will do. We go this way?
Let's bring Claude Millman forward, one of the sponsors of Castellanos and Fink.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you how the experience of prosecuting, especially high-profile public corruption cases, affects your relationship with offices where you get referrals within the city and state, particularly, for example, you mentioned the Department of Investigations, that office, the city controller's office also has an investigative arm. How do those relationships survive that experience of bringing high-profile corruption cases?
I've not had any problem with it. I mean, obviously, my greatest experience has been with Rose, and it was wonderful because, you know, the people in those positions tend to understand that you're actually serving your administration best if you're getting rid of the bad guys. And that's true whether you're talking about public corruption cases or Wall Street cases. I mean, a lot of people suggest, you know, everybody on Wall Street must hate you and all the people at hedge funds must hate you. The greatest congratulations that I have gotten have been from people who have said, we're glad you're doing it because you're not just leveling the playing field for the average investor, you're leveling the playing field for the non-average investor because you're getting rid of the people who year after year after year have been causing lots of capital to come into their hedge fund, to use that example again, because they're cheating and they're using an unlawful edge. So my experience has been that right-minded people think that the partnership is terrific.
Thank you.
Steve Cohen, former intern in your office. Go back to your metaphor, if you would, of
You're not running a
barnacles.
hedge fund now, are you?
No, I'm the poor Steve Cohen. Go back to the metaphor of barnacles on the hull of the ship, if you would. How extensive?
It's a lot of barnacles. A lot of barnacles.
A lot of barnacles.
Yeah.
And compare it, if you would, or to mix metaphors, the tip of the iceberg, compared to the financial industry. Albany versus the financial industry. Where are we seeing more extensive problems from your perspective?
Yeah. I don't know. People always ask, it's like how much sugar do you put in the restaurant? I don't know. And let me just repeat saying that there are lots and lots and lots of good people in every institution. And I'll repeat something that I say when I speak to the business schools, because it sometimes seems like, God, Preet's a pain in the neck, and he's always a scold, he's always wagging his finger. I think most people are actually good. And I think most people want to do the right thing. And when I say, this is a roundabout way of answering your question, by not answering it at all. And I say to groups of students, I say, the reason I'm here, and I'm actually speaking in Harvard Business School to the entire first-year class, and I've been doing it for 4 years running, to talk about how to stay out of trouble a little bit. And I say, look, the reason I'm here is not only because it's sort of a scared straight program for white-collar people, although it's a little bit that. And it's not only to direct my words to the 2 or 3 of you who, statistically speaking, are likely to commit serious securities fraud, although I know who you are, and will be following you out of the classroom. But it's really to direct my words to the ears of the vast majority of people in this room and in most places who are good and right and honorable and honest and have integrity and want to do the right thing. The problem is not so much the bad guys, although the bad guys are a problem. The biggest problem is the good guys who don't do anything about it. And whether you're talking about a hedge fund or you're talking about a legislature or you're talking about Penn State, the biggest, I think, institutional problem you have, not just in America and certainly not just in New York, but in any culture, society, institution, is figuring out a way to make sure that good people who began with good intentions don't just sit on the sidelines when something bad is going on. When fraud is taking place or bribes are taking place or young boys are getting raped, people have to stand up and do things. And the sad experience of doing this job for a long time is, in some ways, seeing the bad people do the bad things. But what is even more dispiriting and troubling is that in most of the big cases you read about in our office, lots and lots of people knew that bad things were happening before the FBI showed up. Right? That was true in the Galleon case. That was true in SAC Capital. That's true in Toyota. It's true in so many cases. And if we could figure out a way to less talk about the bad, there's always going to be bad people, and there are always going to be evil people, and people who think they can get over and not be on the level. But if you can somehow figure out a way to give courage to the people who know better and knew better and were brought up better and want to do the right thing, then I think you can solve a lot of problems that way. But I can't compare Albany versus Wall Street.
We're running close to the end, and I'll just take the questions of the people standing.
My name is Scott Kaplan. Thank you for your service. My question is, where are our local prosecutors? Should we be angry that district attorneys, elected district attorneys, and the elected attorney general rarely bring public these cases and also police misconduct cases? It always seems to be the feds that hold our elected officials accountable.
No, I don't think you should be angry. I can only speak about the work that we do, and I don't know what kinds of leads other offices get. I don't know what kinds of priorities other offices have. The Manhattan District Attorney and I get along very well, and he's, I think, a terrific prosecutor and has done a lot of important cases, as has the State Attorney General, significant public prosecutions, public corruption prosecutions, as well as financial prosecutions. So I can't really speak to that, and sometimes we work on things and investigate things together. So I have no complaints.
Hello, Mr. Bharara. I have a question. A lot of people were inspired by your office dedicating a team of prosecutors to look at Rikers Island and make recommendations for reform. Given the larger debate building on Scott's question about the city looking at the city examining problems with police brutality and police officer-involved killings, couldn't your office also dedicate a team of prosecutors to examine the NYPD and make recommendations?
Yeah, thank you for complimenting the work of the office with respect to Rikers Island. I mean, I think people don't always appreciate that we do all sorts of cases, and that our obligation is to uphold the law and enforce the law, not just against people who are rank and file citizens who break the law, but also against the law enforcers themselves. And we have a very proud record of doing that. As I have said on other occasions, you hate to do it, and it breaks your heart. But since I've been the U.S. Attorney, 20 police officers have gone to prison for various crimes. We have sent FBI agents to prison for committing crimes. And so, those are forms of public corruption, which is part of what we're talking about today. So there's nothing more important than that. With respect to the New York City Police Department, I think my sense is there are a lot of people looking at that. There's now, an inspector general. There are court decrees. There's a continuing court case. There have been times when the Southern District of New York and some other U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of New York some years ago thought it made sense to take a deeper look because of things that were going on. And if that ever happens, we don't hesitate to do so. I had a great relationship with Ray Kelly. I have a great relationship with Commissioner Bratton. I think they're both unbelievably strong and good and smart and thoughtful and caring public servants. That doesn't mean that there's not sometimes bad things that go on there. And Commissioner Kelly acknowledged that when he had to, and Commissioner Bratton acknowledges that. And if there ever comes a time, as I said before, we're not scared of anybody. And, we look at our partners as partners, but when they cross the line, we take appropriate action there also. So, but I thank you for your comment.
Good morning, Richard Barr. As has been said, your office has a tremendously impressive record in going after public corruption. But I wanted to ask about one particular case. As I understand it, it was probably just before you took over the office. Nelson Castro was elected to the state legislature to represent a district in the West Bronx, and your office, either right before or right after the election, became aware of some conduct of his that caused him to agree to wear a wire in return, presumably for some more lenient treatment, and that this arrangement continued through the next 2 election cycles, as I believe.
Yeah, I think that was under my tenure. That was 1 election cycle. Yeah.
Okay, where he was reelected. Obviously, it was before it became public knowledge. Obviously, he was providing you with useful information during that time. But my question is, what about the enfranchised voters of that district who were deprived of the knowledge that the man representing them was under criminal investigation and went to the polls and reelected him, whereas had they known this, perhaps they would not have? Didn't they have the right to know sooner who was representing them and what was his situation?
Yeah, that is a great and legitimate question, and I will answer it this way. We make decisions all the time about when to be overt in an investigation and when to remain covert, because we have sometimes competing principles and interests. And one, I'll analogize to the financial area for a moment and then come back to the particular question that you asked. We all the time get information about someone engaging in bad conduct. And sometimes it's the case you can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and so you let it go on and you monitor it and you make sure that people are not unduly harmed in the broader interest of trying to make sure you can gather and develop enough evidence so that when it becomes public, that person doesn't flee, that person doesn't destroy evidence, and that person can be held accountable and put in prison for as long as is deserved. In addition to that, we're not only just talking about that person, because sometimes it comes to light that someone has engaged in bad conduct, but he or she is not the only one, or he or she is at the bottom of the totem pole, and there are 6 other bad guys. And sometimes that's true in violence cases and organized crime cases, and cases that are not just about money and graft, but cases that affect people's lives. And if you don't do it properly, people will die. And sometimes, with great care and sensitivity, you have to make judgment calls of how long you let something go on, whether it's a gun running operation or it's a crew of the Bonanno crime family, because the goal is to hold responsible and to incapacitate as many people as possible who are responsible for breaking the law and terrorizing people or breaking faith with the public. So we're always struggling with that. The case you described was, I think, a particularly difficult struggle, because at the time if I recall correctly, at the time that election was coming up, we did not have all the evidence with respect to other people who engaged in bad conduct. And so it is a legitimate question as to whether or not we just should have thrown up our hands and called it a day and exposed that person and then gone home, as opposed to letting it run a little longer so a number of other additional people, including another public official, could be charged and held accountable. And at the end of the day, and again, I really appreciate that, because we thought long and hard about it. So, for people who disagreed with the decision, you should understand that we didn't do it in a cavalier way or in a casual way, and we thought about it a lot, because enfranchisement is important. I'll give you another example of that in a moment, about the timing of how we act. But ultimately, both that individual and other individuals were taken out of office, and I think at the end of the day, a greater public service was done in terms of accountability and having people be true representatives of the public than if we had called it quits earlier. Another reason why we bring cases at sometimes earlier than we might is because we think bad things are happening, and people can not only be disenfranchised if there's an election, but people can be disenfranchised if we wait too long to charge someone when there are bills under consideration, as is happening now. So, the job is a good one, but there are judgment calls like that we have to make all the time. We do the best we can.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning, sir. On the topic of public corruption, 20 years ago, Chief Judge Sal Wachtler was prosecuted for alleged crimes, which he eventually pleaded guilty to, by the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey, that was then Michael Chertoff, not the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, because it was an apparent conflict of interest for the Chief Judge of New York to be investigated and prosecuted by the Southern District U.S. Attorney. Flash forward to today, the Bridgegate investigation, Governor Christie is being investigated. There's an investigation taking place by the Mr. Fishman, the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey. Some would say the investigation is languishing. My question is, do you believe that there is at least an appearance of impropriety for the immediate successor to Chris Christie to be investigating him when his office is surely filled with many assistant U.S. attorneys and investigators? And is there anything that you or your office can do to take over that investigation?
If you want to write a letter to someone and suggest something, that's your right as a citizen. Look, I don't know about that case. I don't know what the considerations are. I get asked about other people's investigations from time to time. I don't comment on them in the same way that I wouldn't like it if other people commented on the investigations that are being done out of my office. I come from New Jersey. New Jersey is a great state. Paul Fishman's a great United States attorney, and I'm sure that he'll do the right thing in the right time.
Okay, very good.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't go away. Well, this has been a remarkable morning, and I thank you all, and I especially thank U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara for an extraordinary morning. I want to just acknowledge Mayor Dinkins, who's been in the audience and has been here the whole time. Mayor Dinkins, 87 years old and still going strong. Thank you. As we always do, we'd like to give a product of the scholarship of this law school to the speakers that we've done for this is the 118th breakfast. For this breakfast, I asked my friend and former colleague, U.S. Attorney's Office, Frank Turkheimer, who's a visiting professor here at New York Law School, his book, Forgotten Trials of the Holocaust, a great and very valuable read about Holocaust trials and the correctness and importance of them. Not the most famous, the Nuremberg ones, but the others. And I give it to you with appreciation and thanks for a wonderful morning and a stimulating day. Thank you.